Are you a businesswoman who is finding it challenging to get your ideas across and make a point? Welcome to Speakers Who Get Results with Elizabeth Bachman, a podcast dedicated to helping women get the visibility they want, whether making a speech or talking in a meeting. Every week, get valuable lessons from Elizabeth or learn from her roundtable conversations with experts and speakers on how to make a difference, not just a point. On to the show with your host, Elizabeth Bachman.
Hello, and welcome to Speakers Who Get Results. I'm Elizabeth Bachman, your host, and this is the podcast where we interview experts from around the world on such subjects as visibility, presentation skills, leadership, and communication challenges. Today, we have a very interesting analysis of a famous speech to give you an idea of some of the ways that speaker trainers, presentation skills trainers, think and analyze presentation. And in order for you to analyze your presentation and your skills, I invite you to take 4 minutes to try our free online assessment at speakforresultsquiz.com. That's www.speakforresultsquiz.com. And that's where you can see where you're strong and where perhaps a little bit of support could get you the results you need and the recognition that you deserve. My guest today is Dr. Nick Morgan, who is a very experienced presentation skills trainer, speaker trainer, author, professor, and we are going to analyze Martin Luther King Jr.'s "I Have a Dream" speech. We're going to think about the context, the audience, the techniques he used, where he began to improvise and ad lib, and how it all fits together to have become one of the most recognized speeches of the 20th century and still today. Now, the official bio for Dr. Morgan is in the show notes because it's long and extensive. But here are a few highlights. Dr. Nick Morgan is one of America's top communication speakers, theorists, and coaches. A passionate teacher, he's committed to helping people find clarity in their thinking and ideas, and then delivering them with panache. He has himself spoken, led conferences, and moderated panels in venues around the world. During the last election cycle, Nick provided expert commentary on the presidential debates for CNN. His latest book is "Can You Hear Me?" on the perils of virtual communication, which was published by Harvard in 2018. So that was well before the pandemic shut everybody out and put us all into virtual communication. Nick appears frequently on radio and TV. He has founded his own communications training consulting organization called Public Words, which has been in business since 1997. Kudos to you for that. Nick attributes his success to his honest and direct approach that challenges even the most confident orators to rethink how they communicate. You're in for a treat. Here's the interview with Dr. Nick Morgan. Nick Morgan, welcome to Speakers Who Get Results.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be with you, Elizabeth.
And it's such a pleasure to be with you too, especially someone who is also a presentation skills trainer with such an illustrious background. We're going to have fun today. Before we get into the meat of the conversation, though, I'm always curious who people's dream interview would be. So if you could interview somebody who's no longer with us, someone from history, who would it be? What would you ask them? And who should be listening?
Yeah, well, no question for me. I spent a good deal of my early professional life writing a dissertation first on, and then a book on Charles Dickens. And so he's always been a great love of mine, and a huge amount of fascination for that great creative genius. So that would be my choice. It's a tough one. It's a tough question because there are a number of people.
Yeah.
I was just thinking about J.R.R. Tolkien, whom I'd love to interview, especially as all these movies are coming out about him. But if I had to pick one, it would be Charles Dickens.
What was it about Charles Dickens that got you interested?
Well, his creativity took a really interesting form. Of course, it was prodigious. We know that he wrote 14, 15 big books. And then as I was doing my research on him, in fact, I discovered that there were 3,000 pages of miscellanea that he'd also written, which would be an output of a lifetime for most people. That was just the stuff he did in his spare time. His creativity was prodigious. But what was particularly fascinating about his creativity was he was really gifted at seeing people as curious objects and curious objects as people.
Okay.
And so he animated the world around him. And he also saw people in very amusing ways, depending on the depth of acquaintance that the reader needed to have with that person. So it was the ability to sort of flip back and forth between surroundings and between scenery and actor that was fascinating to me. He was extraordinarily creative in that way in particular.
You mentioned when we were chatting about this the other day that as you were teaching it, though, you had a hard time getting your students to read the 600-page novels. Talk a little bit about audience expectations.
Yeah, it's really fascinating to me that if I can just switch the question slightly, I'll make it even more.
Professor.
Thanks. Even more pointed, perhaps. We're talking in a sense about attention spans, and the reason I want to shift the phrasing slightly is just because everybody's so worried about attention spans these days. We're worried about information overload. We're worried, as we spend a lot of time on Zoom, about keeping the other person's attention or the audience's attention. We were worried about it before the pandemic, but we got even more worried about it now. There's lots of evidence that information overload steadily increases, and how we cope with that is fascinating to me. So how you think about your audience and how much you believe that it can pay attention to you is a sort of a predilection of ours. It's something we worry about a lot. And Dickens handled it in his day, pre-television, pre-social media, pre-internet, pre-everything. He handled it by writing his big stories in parts, weekly parts at first, and then as he got more and more famous and slowed down a little bit, he did monthly parts, which he liked better, although he still struggled with both sets of deadlines.
I know, like the functional equivalent of a TV series or a mini series that you then put together and create, or a 4-part mini series, which you then put together and create a full film out of.
Yeah, and Dickens works very well, as the BBC has demonstrated for us with several of his novels. It works very well broken up in parts like that. And what's fascinating to me is that while we worry about attention spans and we worry about keeping our audience's attention, yet we're all known to binge watch, say, Game of Thrones or whatever your favorite current Netflix show is. So attention spans are very malleable depending on how engaged we are. And Dickens understood beautifully how to engage people with fascinating stories and lots at stake, and the classic issues of love and life and death and riches and poverty
and social commentary too. Yeah,
and a lot of social commentary, which he really woke up his reading audience to in a lot of ways. He was a muckraker.
A muckraker is someone who digs into the mud and the muck of the garbage of the world, for our international listeners.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, exactly. So, for example, he wrote about schools, which were designed basically to be parking lots for kids of who were unwanted for one reason or another, and the terrible things, the terrible conditions under which those children, laughingly described as students, tried to learn, tried to just to survive. And there was such shock when Dickens wrote about that that there were actually parliamentary hearings and changes made in the laws, and justice was done in at least some way.
So if you could
Powerful
talk,
speaker.
if you could talk to him one-on-one, what would you ask him?
One of my favorite things about Dickens was that he was known for having a 3-4 hour dinner of an evening. And the Victorian dinners were prodigious.
Yeah.
And they often were followed by speeches and toasts and hilarious by the day entertainment of these folks giving witty repartee with each other. And at that point, then all his friends would trundle off to bed and sleep off the excessive amounts of punch and food they'd drunk and eaten. Dickens would, at that point, put on his walking shoes and go stomp around London often from midnight to 5 a.m, because he had so much energy, he often neglected to sleep. And that's a lot of where he learned the muckraking, as we just referred to, stories, the seamier, the nastier sides of London life, for example, by investigating it firsthand in the middle of the night. And so, and then he was famous for getting up early, getting up at 5, if he indeed had ever gone to bed. Yeah. And starting to work and writing for a few hours before the rest of the day. So I'd love to ask him where he got his energy and where he got his creative drive from, because this was a guy who, even by Victorian standards, was an extraordinary worker.
Wow, that's really fun. It was so much fun when you wrote down that you wanted to interview Dickens, I thought, oh, here's someone who is fascinated by words the way I am. And so I really, I would be there for that interview. I would love to listen to that interview. It sounds fascinating. I've asked you here today, however, to talk from the point of view, we are both presentation skills trainers. We help people do speeches. We do speeches of our own. One of the most famous speeches of the 20th century is Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech, which he probably thought was going to be the promissory note speech and sort of turned into "I Have a Dream" by accident. I thought what would be really interesting to do would be to talk about that speech from the point of view, your point of view as a senior speaker trainer, and my point of view as someone who's been doing presenting her whole life, and really sort of think about it. To the audience, to our listeners and watchers, we could not play clips of the speech without breaking copyright. And we really want to honor the copyright of the King family and the King estate. So we will be referring to it. I suggest that you go back, listen to this, and then go listen to the speech, listen for the things that we've talked about. So Nick, how do you start talking about this speech? Give us some context for those who weren't around in 1963.
Great. Yeah. So one of the greatest speeches, certainly of the 20th century, and still one that lives with us today. So a speech well worthy of study. It's 17 minutes and a bit long. So it's not a long speech. For those of you who haven't watched it yet, it came near the end of a long day of speeches on a hot day in the summer. The folks who were sitting and standing listening to Martin Luther King Jr. Had been hearing a lot of other speeches leading up to that. He was sort of the finale for the day. And it was a huge crowd, something like 300,000 people. So
because it was part of the March on Washington.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. And they reached their destination, and now is the time to talk about what they wanted to accomplish and what the meaning of the march was. So So a really high stakes speech in a lot of ways. And one of the things that I always think about, and I know you do, and any speech coach does, is what are the circumstances of the speech? Because that makes a huge difference. If you're speaking early in the morning, you've got one kind of audience. If you're speaking late at night after dinner, after wine has been served, you've got another kind of audience. If you're speaking at the end of a long day on a hot summer's day, a hot August day with no shade to 300,000 people who have been sitting outside for a long period of time, you've got another audience on your hands. How do you grab their attention and hold it? How do you understand? How do you sympathize with them and where they are? So that's an important part of the speech. And as we'll see, Martin Luther King reacted brilliantly to those circumstances. Just to build a little suspense into our discussion. But the place I start is always that every speech like this is two conversations. And the first conversation is the content. It's what you're trying to say. And the second conversation is the body language, roughly speaking, the nonverbal communications, as we say, if we're trying to sound like experts and scientific. And when those two are aligned, you can be an effective communicator. When they're not aligned, what happens is the body language always trumps the content. And that sounds more complicated than it is. If, in other words, if Martin Luther King had walked up there to the podium and said something like many professional speakers do, "I'm really happy to be here today." And I'm way oversimplifying anything a real speaker might do, but that's just to make a point here that I slumped a little bit and I said with low energy in my voice, "I'm happy to be here today." So there we've got the two conversations. We've got the content, "I'm happy to be here today." And we've got the body language, the slump and the pitch forward head and the low energy in the voice. And the question is, which do you believe? And the answer then, it becomes obvious and simple. Of course, we believe the way in which the words are delivered. The exact words aren't as important, although exact words often can be important. But in terms of decoding the intent of the speaker, exact words aren't as important as the way in which they're delivered, other things being equal. So Martin Luther King, like all speakers, has to get two things right. He has to not only deliver some fabulous content out on the Washington Mall, but he also has to do it in a way that sounds like he means it. And with 300,000 people in front of him, and if you think about the folks toward the back of the audience, they can barely see him. He's just a tiny little figure off in the distance. He really has to hammer those words home. So that's his first challenge: is how do I align those two things, the content and the body language?
Well, and another thing to think about that audience is these are people who had marched up from the South of civil rights to protest, to ask for civil rights when people in the South, Black people in the South were being beaten and killed and lynched, and voting rights were suppressed, etc. So they had marched to the Capitol. They got to the Lincoln Memorial, which is also significant because of Lincoln and having written the Emancipation Proclamation. No accident that it was Lincoln, not Washington or any other monument. He also knew not only was he speaking to his people who had marched with him, but official Washington was listening. Official America was listening. It was on TV, which is something that a couple of decades earlier would not have been the case. So Lincoln's Gettysburg Address was not broadcast.
Right.
So how do you think, putting yourself in his shoes, how do you think he balanced what the audience in front of him, the marchers, wanted, and what the officials who were on the podium with him and America listening on the TV?
Yes, it's a really fabulous question, because he had a very fine line to follow in order to provide enough courage, hope, and inspiration to the people who were following him and the people in his circles who were demanding more and more of him all the time. And then Also, as we know now, the FBI was listening in, and of course they were probably watching it on TV in this case. But the official Washington was certainly watching him for signs that he was straying off of the nonviolent path, which he had so carefully espoused all the way through. And the speech is a very careful mixture in that sense of hope and realism about how things stand.
And caution.
And caution in any way that could be considered a call to violence. He's very careful to stay on that side of the issue. And for those who weren't alive then, that was very much in the air, and people were hoping to catch Martin Luther King becoming an advocate of violence, because then it would have been easy to dismiss him. One of the brilliant things about the nonviolent aspect of that movement was that even though the protesters were subjected personally to violence, some of them were killed, and many of them were beaten up and abused in many ways. They were arrested. They were treated badly in various county and state prisons all over the South, especially. And yet they never fell off the nonviolent wagon, which gave them a moral high ground that Martin Luther King was very keen to maintain. And on the other side, they had people then like Malcolm X who were pushing him further and saying, "You're not doing enough. You're being too weak in this situation. You need to be stronger. You need to get real here and meet violence with violence." And so a very difficult, extraordinarily narrow line that he could follow. And he just does that very well in the speech, even though he departs from the written speech, the speech that he'd prepared eventually in the course of the text. And I'm sure we'll get to this, and starts ad-libbing, which is another extraordinary thing. I like to tell my clients when we're talking about the speech, I'll say, well, we're spending a lot of time preparing this speech. Just want you to know that one of the best speeches of the 20th century, and still one of the most evocative speeches in recent American history, was half prepared in advance, half ad lib. So let's set the bar high here if we can. You know, if you, that is a client, starts to ad lib, I expect great things, because now you know how to do it. Just model yourself on the "I have a dream" speech. And their result always is, their response always is, "Thanks for that. I appreciate the vote of confidence." So
right.
It's a high bar. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. Okay. So he was balancing his rhetoric, his words, for walking that line between inspiring his people, calming down the ones who really wanted to go violent, and knowing that official America was listening. What else should we know about this speech? Or what else should we notice when we go back and watch it?
Oh, so many things. So one of the frustrations is it was not filmed with you and I in mind. That is, it was filmed like a TV show, in the sense that the camera pans over to Martin Luther King at the podium, and we see him for a few seconds talking, and then it swings around and we see other people on the stage, and then it goes to the audience and we see the audience. And of course, I'm thinking, I don't care about the audience. I mean, I do, but at this point, I want to see this precious artifact. I want to see every single second of Martin Luther King speaking, because I want to study every single twitch, every facial expression, every gesture, and we don't get to do that. So you only get to see him occasionally, but you do see enough to pick up on some of his nonverbal language. And of course, you can hear his voice, which is his biggest and best asset, a truly extraordinary voice, honed over many years of Sunday preaching. And so we can learn enough about the second conversation to be able to make some comparisons and learn some things about his craft and about the way he delivered that particular speech.
Please go on. Let's hear more about it, the way he delivered the speech.
Okay, so he begins with a fairly even pacing and phrasing. He doesn't start out at a high pitch. This speech begins slowly. And early in the speech, for the first 6 or 7 minutes, he's reading from a prepared text, as we were talking beforehand, he had been working on the speech for quite some time. There are various accounts. The one that seems to be the most authoritative is a wonderful book, which I recommend highly, called Behind the Dream by Clarence Jones, who was Martin Luther King's speechwriter, co-writer, whatever you want to call it. And they apparently have been working on the themes, the I Have a Dream theme, for quite some time. They'd worked on the speech a few weeks beforehand at Clarence Jones's house when they had a weekend off, essentially. And then they worked on it the night before to finish up. And they settled on the opening metaphor, which basically says Black Americans were promised some things, and America as a whole has not yet delivered on them. And he used the metaphor of a promissory note. So things are owed to the people in front of him, in the audience, and around America.
And that's a legal term we don't use so much anymore, right? What does it mean? It's
an official debt, as it were. So, I mean, it's not unlike a mortgage, basically, but it's saying you owe this money. We've signed the agreement. We agree that we owe this money, and this money is now due. And he's using it metaphorically. So it's the freedom and justice and equal rights and the end of Jim Crow South and so on and so forth that are now due African Americans. And the thing about that is, you say today it's not a term we use so much. The term was more in use then, but it's still a fairly intellectual concept. And again, think back to 300,000 people, hot day, end of the afternoon, and that's a tough metaphor to get across. And one of the things that's fascinating to me about that speech is that the language in it is quite sophisticated, in the sense that nowadays we tell our political audiences or our political speechwriters and people speaking to political audiences, say during a presidential campaign or indeed any political campaign, to quote, dumb it down to the 8th grade level or even lower. Former President Trump,
speak in the vernacular, speak in everyday speech. Yes.
Former President Trump was analyzed, I think, at the 5th grade level, something like that. You can analyze the level of the vocabulary. So politicians have tended to dumb it down. One of the extraordinary things about Martin Luther King was he didn't dumb it down. He uses words like nullification and interposition and big 3-4 syllable words and sophisticated concepts. And so he's not pulling any punches for his audience, and he expected them to follow. Nonetheless, he sensed early on in this long paragraph or two about the promissory note that it wasn't really getting much of a response. And at that point, and you can see the moment happen, so I recommend everybody to look about halfway through the speech after he gets done saying, I'm not unmindful of what all the suffering you have gone through, that is speaking directly to the audience. That's the first time he speaks directly to the audience. And at that point, he puts down his text, and you can see it because early on the speech, when he's doing the promissory note bit, he's looking down to get the concept and then looking up to deliver it like a typical speaker would do, reading from a written text. As soon as he gets to the I am not unmindful of your suffering bit, he starts looking straight out at the audience, and he doesn't look back down at the text after that. So that's how we know the second half of the speech, roughly speaking, is ad-libbed. And it was because he felt that he wasn't connecting with the audience. And as a preacher, he was very used to getting the amen, getting the audience response. He knew how to do it, and he knew what it sounded like and what it should sound like. And when he saw that he wasn't getting it, then he thought, okay, I've got to up the ante here, up the rhetorical stakes, and start connecting with that audience. And that's when he started using the classic preacher technique that led to the I have a dream statement, where you put a phrase like that out, I have a dream. You get the response from the audience, and then you ad lib on that, and then you repeat the phrase, and the phrase gets richer each time you repeat it. So he repeats the I have a dream phrase about 6 times, and each time he talks about what that dream would look like and adds a little bit to it. And he's getting the response each time.
That's actually something I wanted to point out. And notice, as I went back and when I was preparing for this interview, I went back and really listened with my speaker trainer hat on, where he would talk about the green hills and the valley being lifted and the mountains brought low. And then instead of finishing at the end of that phrase and starting the next one with, I have a dream that da 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 da, he would say, the mountains and hills brought low, I have a dream.
Yes.
Breathe.
Right.
And then sometimes he repeats, sometimes he doesn't. But that is a very interesting technique, not something you hear a lot nowadays.
No.
Although I don't listen to a lot of Baptist preachers, so I don't really know. But
it's still a technique used in Baptist preaching, yes, but it's rarer now than in those days. And he used it with a kind of brilliance that few people achieve. And he sometimes varied the phrase to "I have a dream" and "I have a dream today." And both "dream" and "today" are good words to end a sentence on. So it was a particularly good phrase to repeat and to come back to. And that's important. If you have a difficult phrase to say, then the repetition doesn't go as well. And I say that because after doing about half a dozen "I have a dreams," remember, he's still in ad lib mode. He still has to finish the speech at this point. We're about 10 minutes in, and he's still got 7 minutes to go. Then he says, "with this faith." And he repeats that a few times. Now, what happens then is the audience goes completely cold. And if you think about it, "with this faith" just doesn't sing in the same way that "I have a dream" sings. And it's even hard to say "with this faith," too many THs. So it's a mouthful, and the word faith doesn't ring in the same way that dream does. That E sound is a nice open sound. So just in terms of the linguistics, it's harder to get that phrase out, and it's just not as evocative a phrase. So he repeats that, "with this faith, we're going to do this, that, and the other thing," and then he realizes pretty quickly that that's not working. So he drops that, and he goes into, and this is really my favorite moment in the speech, because he cites the song "Let Freedom Ring," and "America, my country, 'tis of thee." And then he picks up the "Let Freedom Ring" at the end of that, the verse that he cites, and he starts using that. That isn't yet. That comes a bit later. So it's "Let Freedom Ring," and then he starts using that as a catchphrase. Now, by all rights, because that catchphrase "Let Freedom Ring," he repeats that 10 times. That comes at the end or toward the end of the speech. You're absolutely right. It's right up to free at last, thank God Almighty, free at last." He's saying "Let freedom ring." He's repeating that. By all rights, that should be what we call the speech. We should call it the "Let Freedom Ring" speech, because it came at the end. It's arguably a great phrase, "Let freedom ring." It comes from a well-known song. And the question really is, why didn't we all think of it as the "Let Freedom Ring" speech, given that freedom was a big part of what he was talking about? And I think there are two reasons. I think there's both a reason that has to do with the meaning and a reason that has to do with the phrase. The meaning of dream is, it's a powerful word. When you tell people start dreaming, they do. They dream big. It cuts them loose. It gives them permission to start imagining what life could be like. It's like the word "imagine." It's a powerful word to use in a speech in public. "Let freedom ring." Who knows what that means when you really think about it? Like, "Let freedom ring." I mean, it refers probably to the bell of freedom. But we don't listen to a lot of bells in '63. Maybe we listen to more of them than we do now. But "let freedom ring" is a little on the abstract side. So what exactly does it mean? I don't know. So it didn't resonate in the same way in terms of meaning. And then "dream" is a nice finished sound. So it's got the open E, but it comes to the close at an M, whereas "ring" just kind of goes on and peters out, right? So as a sound, it's not as effective to say "Let freedom ring" as it is to say "I have a dream," and you can really punch that.
Well, and the D, which gives the plosive attack. All my years with opera singers talking about diction.
There you go. Please.
The D
Yeah.
in dream as opposed to
punch.
the F in faith
Yeah.
and the R in ring.
Right.
You can hear how dream have so much more impact.
Yes. Yes. So he doesn't get the response and let freedom ring. And even though the phrases, when you listen to it, you'll see he's saying, let freedom ring from the Rockies to the snow-capped mountains of California, to Georgia, to Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. He's citing some of these places that have significance and where things have happened in the civil rights movement, as well as places from which the folks in the audience have come. And that's always a popular thing to do, right? Is to say, anybody here from Dubuque? This is a kind of an elegant version of that. And even so, he's getting some response, but it's not like the response he got on I Have a Dream. And so then he goes into the end of the free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last. And the crowd goes wild. Now, they go wild for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's a great phrase, and he delivers it in perfect cadence. And second, you can see, if you're watching the video, that he raises his hand like this, which is a sign in Baptist churches that you're coming to the end. It's the physical equivalent of saying, "Can I get an amen?"
Yeah.
And the audience sees that, and many of them, I'm sure, had come from churches around the United States and were familiar with that gesture. So they knew he was bringing it home, and this was time to finish. So when you talk about body language and the two conversations, the content conversation and the body language conversation, uniting, they united perfectly in the end there with the right cadence, the right phrase, and everything going together to create a really powerful moment. But it all began with I Have a Dream.
Oh, this is fascinating. I want to point out a couple of other things that I know I've learned from my 30 years in opera, where another thing, he may not have been conscious of it, but another factor is if you're speaking into a microphone and you've got 3,000 people listening on loudspeakers, especially the loudspeakers that you have had in 1963, echoes make a big difference. And one of the things that I learned early on in my opera days, one of the reasons why Italian is a language that carries so well, and why Italians learned how to project their voices, is because it comes from the church, where the priests had to speak and fill a big echoey stone church. By the time you get to Southern Baptists, they're in smaller churches, but you still have that tradition of oratory. Through the 18th century, 19th century, you didn't have loudspeakers. So, Abraham Lincoln, talking about 77 years ago, would have been speaking loud and pausing so that the echoes can die down and you can hear when he's going to start again. By the time you get to Martin Luther King, you've got the whole tradition of oratory, which was really featured in the 19th century, informing the churches of the Southern Baptists, where you're expecting people to sing back, and it becomes almost song. And then you have to think about sustained phrases, sustained words. One of the things I've learned in producing operas, when you're trying to do something outdoors, the ballads will sell better than the fast ones. Comedy is really hard to do outdoors. I mean, I've produced lots of concerts in churches. Comic songs, patter songs, are hard because that's where the words are more important than the tune. And the echoes get in the way. It's really hard. So we would save 11 years of the Tyrolean opera program. Sometimes we were in big echoey churches. Sometimes we were in small civic halls. We would save the fast things and the comic pieces for the small places where you don't have so much echo.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah.
So when you're thinking about, I have a dream, he's letting the dream echo.
Yes.
Probably by that point in his career, he wasn't aware of it, but I can guarantee whoever trained him as a preacher knew that. So that's one of the interesting things. Another couple of things that I've noticed is he uses a lot of biblical references, again, because he's a preacher and because a lot of his audience come from the church. The church is where their community is the church. He's not talking about ROI and stock charts and so forth.
Right.
And the other part is in terms of the educated language, the kind of the highfalutin, tricky words. I wonder if he consciously developed that so that white America would take him seriously. Again, that's another one. I don't know if he did it consciously or if maybe early on he started using big words because he wanted white America to pay attention and take him seriously as Dr. King instead of that backwoods preacher.
Yeah, he had to work at not being dismissed. There were people were looking for all kinds of ways to dismiss him, whatever they could do. And we talked earlier about the violence. They were hoping he would stray into violence so that they could dismiss him in that way or crack down on him. And to your point, I'm sure you're right that he wanted to say that this is serious stuff, serious intellectual stuff.
I'm sure there's a PhD student out there somewhere who has compared Gandhi's speeches in terms of pioneering the nonviolent things to Martin Luther King's speeches. I don't speak Gandhi's language, so I don't know what it sounded like in the original, but I'm sure there's a PhD dissertation out there somewhere that talks about that. Nick Morgan, we could talk about this for hours, but we'd probably better do it someday with our feet up in an adult beverage. And if we ever get a chance to meet in person, we can sit down and just take this part. It's been such an honor and a joy to have you on Speakers Who Get Results. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you. I'll be delighted to talk about this speech and with you anytime. So thank you.
Okay. So this has been Speakers Who Get Results. Once again, I'm Elizabeth Bachman, your host. My guest was the great Nick Morgan. And if you are interested in learning more about this, I will post some links in the show notes. And if you're interested how your presentation skills could perhaps get you to speaking on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, you can take our free 4-minute quiz at speakforresultsquiz.com, where you can see whether your presentation skills, where you're strong and where perhaps a little bit of support could get you the results you need and the recognition that you deserve. This has been Speakers Who Get Results. I'll see you on the next one.
We have just concluded another great episode of Speakers Who Get Results with your host, Elizabeth Bachman. If you got value from today's episode, please feel free to share us with your friends and colleagues. You may also visit elizabethbachman.com for additional resources. Be sure to tune in every week for new episodes, and thanks for tuning in.